August 7, 1942. Over the turquoise waters of the Solomon Islands, Imperial Japanese Navy pilot Saburo Sakai was a god in his element. He banked his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, a machine that felt less like an aircraft and more like an extension of his own body. Below him, the lush green canopy of Guadalcanal was a paradise that had, in the last few hours, become a hell. Smoke columns rose from the island, marking the positions of the American Marines who had just landed, the first audacious American offensive of the Pacific War. For Sakai, this was not a cause for alarm. It was an opportunity. He was a hunter, and the sky was his domain. At 25 years old, Sakai was already a living legend. He was a samurai of the sky, embodying the warrior code of Bushido. He was credited with nearly 60 aerial victories, a staggering number that placed him among the top aces of the Imperial Navy. He had never been wounded in combat. He had never lost a wingman under his command. His confidence was not arrogance. It was a fact, proven time and again in the skies from China to the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. And today, he was flying the perfect weapon. The Zero was the symbol of Japanese air supremacy. It was impossibly agile, able to outturn any Allied fighter with contemptuous ease. It had a phenomenal range that allowed it to strike from hundreds of miles away, and its combination of cannons and machine guns could shred an enemy plane in seconds. For Allied pilots in 1942, the sight of a Zero on their tail was a death sentence. It was a ghost, a phantom, an invincible demon of the sky. Sakai and his squadron from the elite Tainan Air Group had flown from their base in Rabaul, a grueling 560-mile journey, to attack the American invasion fleet. After a swirling, chaotic dogfight over the landing beaches, they were heading home. The fight had been successful. Ships were burning. The Americans had been stung. But as they flew, Sakai spotted them. 8 aircraft, flying in a neat, orderly formation. They were single-engine planes, their shape vaguely familiar. He identified them as American fighters, F-4F Wildcats, a slow, fat, and clumsy opponent for a Zero. For Sakai, this was a gift. 8 more enemy fighters, unaware of his presence, flying in a perfect line for the slaughter. His fuel was low after the long flight, but not that low. The warrior's spirit, the insatiable hunger for one more victory, took over. He signaled to his wingmen to stay back. These were his. He was Saburo Sakai. He would handle this alone. He nudged his Zero into a gentle dive, building speed, positioning himself perfectly behind and below the formation, in their blind spot. He admired their formation flying. It was disciplined, but foolish. They were flying straight and level, seemingly oblivious. He could almost feel pity for them. They were lambs, unaware the wolf was in their midst. He closed the distance. 800 yards, 500 yards, 200 yards. He was so close he could see the details on the American planes, the dark blue paint, the White Star insignia. He selected his target, the last plane in the formation. He centered it in his gun sight. His thumb hovered over the red trigger on his control stick. This would be easy. Too easy. He was about to press the trigger, to send a burst of 20mm cannon fire into the American plane, to watch it blossom into a flower of orange flame. He was about to add another victory to his legendary tally. And in that precise moment of supreme, unshakable confidence, Saburo Sakai made the single greatest mistake of his life. The aircraft he was stalking were not F-4F Wildcat fighters. They were SBD Dauntless Dive bombers. To a casual observer, they might look similar, but in the sky, they were worlds apart. The Wildcat was a fighter designed to fight other planes. The Dauntless was a bomber designed to sink ships. It was slower, less maneuverable, and considered by most fighter pilots to be easy prey. But the Dauntless had something the Wildcat didn't. It had a rear gunner. In fact, it had 2 rear-facing .30 caliber machine guns, operated by a second crewman sitting back-to-back with the pilot. Sakai, in his arrogant approach, had mistaken a pack of wolves for a flock of sheep. He had pulled his peerless Zero fighter alongside what he thought were 8 solo pilots. He was actually facing 8 pilots and 8 gunners, 16 sets of American eyes. And as he prepared to fire, all 16 of those guns swiveled in unison and pointed directly at him. The world exploded in a storm of lead. 8 twin-mounted machine guns, 16 barrels in total, opened fire at point-blank range. The sound was not the familiar chatter of a single opponent, but a deafening, continuous roar, like a giant canvas being ripped apart. Saburo Sakai Zero was instantly engulfed in a hailstorm of .30 caliber bullets. It was a perfect trap, a defensive circle of interlocking fire designed by the dauntless crews for just such an occasion. For an eternity that lasted less than a second, Sakai was frozen in disbelief. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. He was a hunter, not the hunted. His mind struggled to process the horrifying reality. The glass of his canopy didn't just crack. It vanished, pulverized into a million tiny fragments that sandblasted his face. A wave of searing pain erupted on the left side of his head. A bullet had grazed his skull, carving a deep furrow and tearing away his leather helmet and goggles. Another round slammed into his chest, deflected by the parachute harness, but still feeling like a sledgehammer blow that knocked the wind out of him. The instrument panel in front of him disintegrated. Dials shattered, wires sparked, and hot oil sprayed across his lap. His Zero, a moment ago a pristine instrument of war, was now a flying wreck. It shuddered violently, mortally wounded. The pristine engineering of the Mitsubishi factory was being systematically unraveled by a torrent of American steel. Sakai's training, the thousands of hours of instinctual reaction, finally broke through the shock. He shoved the control stick forward and to the right, throwing his Zero into a desperate dive. He had to escape the cone of fire. As he broke away, he felt a new, catastrophic wave of agony. A bullet had smashed through the side of the cockpit and into his left shoulder, shattering the bone and leaving his arm completely paralyzed. He tried to move it to grip the throttle, but it was just dead weight, hanging uselessly at his side. Another bullet had pierced his leg. Blood was everywhere. It streamed from the gash on his head, pouring into his right eye, blinding him. It soaked his flight suit warm and sticky. Through the blur of his one good eye, he saw the ocean rushing up to meet him. He was in an uncontrolled dive, seconds from impact. With a primal scream of effort, he used his right hand and his legs to wrestle the crippled fighter out of the dive, leveling off just a few feet above the waves. He was alive, but he was in a new kind of hell. The god of the sky had been cast down. Saburo Sakai, the invincible ace, was now a grievously wounded man, flying a battered wreck, hundreds of miles from home, deep in enemy territory. The pain was a living entity, a white-hot fire that consumed his entire consciousness. His head throbbed with nauseating rhythm. His left arm was a source of such excruciating torment that he wished he could just tear it from his body. His vision in his right eye was completely gone, obscured by a curtain of his own blood. He was flying with one hand, one eye, and a rapidly fading grip on consciousness. His training screamed at him. Land. Ditch the plane in the water. Wait for rescue. It was the only logical choice. But for Sakai, logic was secondary to something far more powerful. The code of the samurai. To be captured by the enemy with the ultimate dishonor, a shame worse than death. Ditching the plane so close to the American fleet was a guarantee of capture. The thought was unbearable. There was another path, the one that every Japanese pilot was prepared for. If his plane was too damaged to return, his duty was to find an enemy ship and crash his Zero into it, a final, glorious act of self-destruction. He scanned the horizon with his good eye, searching for an American warship. He would die, but he would die with honor, taking some of the enemy with him. And then a different thought pushed through the haze of pain. It was a memory of his commander and the unspoken rule of his squadron. We do not lose wingmen. We all come home. He had flown from Rabaul that morning with his comrades. His duty was not just to die honorably, but to return, to report, to fight again. Ditching was capture. Crashing was suicide. Returning was impossible. And so Saburo Sakai chose the impossible. He turned the nose of his shattered Zero to the northwest, toward Rabaul, 560 miles away. An odyssey of over 4 hours in a plane that was falling apart, with a body that was failing him. The journey began with a battle against himself. He was losing blood at a terrifying rate. The cockpit floor was slick with it. He knew he would soon pass out from blood loss or the sheer, unrelenting pain. He had to stop the bleeding from his head wound with his one good hand. He fumbled with the scarf around his neck. It was a clumsy, agonizing process. He had to fly the plane with his knees while he worked, the stick bumping between them. He finally got the scarf off and pressed it hard against the gash on his head, a makeshift bandage. The pain was blinding, but he held it there, gritting his teeth until the flow of blood into his eyes slowed to a trickle. Next, he had to assess his aircraft. The engine was still running, a miracle, but it was rough, shuddering and coughing. The controls were sloppy. The fuel tanks, thankfully not hit, were still draining at their normal rate. But the real problem was his own body. The paralysis in his left arm meant he couldn't operate the throttle or the canopy. The partial blindness meant his depth perception was gone. He was a cripple flying a cripple. As he flew, a new enemy appeared. Shock. His body began to tremble uncontrollably. A cold sweat drenched his flight suit, chilling him to the bone despite the tropical heat. His thoughts became disjointed, drifting. He saw the faces of his family, his childhood home. The plane would dip a wing, and a sudden lurch would snap him back to reality. Fly the plane. Fly the plane. He repeated it like a mantra, a prayer to keep his fading consciousness anchored to the task. He was flying on pure, unadulterated will. Every minute was a victory. Every mile was a triumph against death. He flew just feet above the waves, a dangerous and exhausting way to fly, but it was his only option. It made him a smaller target and helped him navigate by following the coastline of the island below. He was a ghost, limping home across a hostile ocean, leaving a faint trail of smoke and oil on the water behind him. The invincible samurai was gone. In his place was just a man, broken and bleeding, fighting a desperate, lonely battle for his life, armed with nothing but a shattered airplane and an unbreakable will to survive. The sun beat down relentlessly, a malevolent eye in a vast, empty sky. For Saburo Sakai, the passage of time had become a fluid, meaningless concept, measured only in waves of pain and moments of fleeting consciousness. He had been flying for over 2 hours. The coast of Guadalcanal had long since disappeared behind him, replaced by the endless, shimmering expanse of the Pacific. His world had shrunk to the cracked instrument panel, the vibrating control stick in his right hand, and the throbbing, agonizing symphony of his wounds. The makeshift bandage on his head had done little to stop the bleeding entirely. The right side of his vision was still a reddish-brown blur. He tried blinking, shaking his head, but the damage was not on the surface. He was blind in that eye. He came to accept it with a grim fatalism. He would fly with one eye. He would land with one eye. Or he would die. The paralysis in his left arm was a constant, terrifying reminder of his vulnerability. The arm itself was a dead thing, a piece of meat hanging from his shoulder that felt like it was filled with ground glass. But the paralysis extended further. It numbed his entire left side. He could feel pins and needles in his left leg. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of his pain. Am I dying? Is this what it feels like? He fought it down. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. The greatest challenge was mental. The shock and trauma were causing vivid hallucinations. He saw Phantom Zeros flying in formation with him, his wingmen, their familiar faces nodding encouragement. He would blink his good eye, and they would vanish, leaving him alone again in the terrifying emptiness. He saw American fighters on his tail, ghosts of his past victories come back for revenge. He would instinctively try brake, wrenching the stick, his heart pounding, only to realize the sky was empty. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against his failing body and crippled plane, the other against his own fracturing mind. He knew he needed to stay awake. To pass out was to die. He resorted to desperate measures. He would deliberately bang his head against the side of the cockpit, the sharp jolt of pain a welcome anchor to reality. He bit his lip until it bled. He did anything to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. Sometime during the 3rd hour, a new crisis emerged. The engine, which had been miraculously holding together, began to run rougher. It coughed, sputtered, and the RPMs dipped erratically. The fuel. He was running low. The flight from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and the subsequent combat had used more fuel than planned. His desperate, low-altitude flight home was inefficient. He glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle was hovering near empty. Now a new clock was ticking. He was in a race, not just against his own body, but against the ravenous appetite of his engine. He had conserved every drop. He eased back on the stick, climbing slowly, painfully, to a higher altitude where the air was thinner and the engine would be more efficient. The climb was an agony. The plane felt heavy, sluggish, protesting every foot of altitude gained. At 10,000 feet, he leveled off. The view was clearer, but the feeling of isolation was even more profound. He was a tiny, wounded speck in an infinite bowl of blue. It was up here that he faced another test. A tropical squall, a towering wall of black cloud and driving rain, loomed directly in his path. In a fully functional plane, he would have flown around it, but he didn't have the fuel for a detour. And in his condition, flying into the violent turbulence of the storm would be suicide. He couldn't control the plane with enough precision. He made a choice. He would fly under it. He pushed the nose down, diving back toward the churning sea, the altimeter unwinding rapidly. The transition was jarring. He plunged from the bright sunlight into a gray, misty twilight. Rain hammered against his broken canopy, stinging his face. The wind tossed his small fighter around like a leaf. He wrestled with the controls, his one good arm aching with the strain. The waves below were monstrous, black peaks capped with white foam, reaching up for him. For 20 minutes, he flew in this purgatory, navigating by sheer instinct, keeping the plane level, fighting the turbulence that threatened to tear the wings off or plunge him into the sea. Then, as suddenly as he had entered it, he flew out the other side, back into the sunlight. He had made it. He was still flying. He was still alive. As the 4th hour began, he saw it, a smudge on the horizon. Land. It was New Ireland, the last major island before New Britain, where Rabaul was located. A surge of adrenaline, of pure, unadulterated hope, shot through him. It was the first real sign that his impossible journey might not be impossible after all. But his hope was immediately tempered by a new, horrifying realization. He was not alone. 2 shapes were closing in on him from behind. Fighters. His heart sank. He had come so far, endured so much, only to be shot down at the last moment. He was defenseless. He couldn't dogfight. He couldn't even turn sharply. He braced to the end, his hand resting on the stick, a final, defiant gesture. He would not die without a fight, however futile. The fighters pulled alongside him, one on each wing. Sakai squinted with his good eye. He saw the red roundels on their wings. The Hainamura, they were Japanese. They were his comrades. They waggled their wings, the universal sign of recognition and fellowship. They had seen his battered aircraft, the smoke, the oil, the shattered canopy. They understood. They gently guided their own planes to tuck in close, taking up escort positions. Saburo Sakai, the lone wolf, the ace who always flew ahead, was now being nursed home by his flock. The relief was so overwhelming that it almost broke him. Tears streamed from his good eye, mixing with the blood and the sweat. He was not alone anymore. He was going to make it. The sight of his comrades flanking him was a powerful tonic. But the final test was yet to come. Landing. Rabaul's airfield was now in sight, a familiar slash of brown against the island's deep green. For any pilot, landing a plane is a delicate procedure requiring precision, concentration, and the use of both hands and both feet. For Saburo Sakai, in his current state, it was a task of Herculean difficulty. His left arm was useless. He couldn't operate the throttle to control his speed on final approach. He couldn't deploy his flaps to increase lift and slow the aircraft down for landing. His vision was impaired, robbing him of the crucial depth perception needed to judge his height above the runway. The tricycle landing gear of the Zero, normally an advantage, now presented a unique problem. A bad landing could cause the plane to swerve violently, cartwheel, and explode. His escorting pilots, realizing his predicament, flew in tight formation, shouting encouragement and instructions over the radio. But in the end, Sakai was on his own. He began his approach, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to slow the plane down, but without flaps or throttle control, he had only one option: a stall. He would deliberately fly the plane so slowly that the wings would begin to lose lift, forcing it into a controlled fall onto the runway. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver, one reserved for emergencies, a maneuver he had practiced in training, but never imagined he would have to use to save his own life. He circled the field, trying to bleed off speed, his good hand making tiny, precise movements on the stick, his legs working the rudder pedals. He lined up with the runway. The ground rushed up at him. He could hear the stall warning horn begin to shriek, a high-pitched wail that signaled the wings were about to stop flying. He held it, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to add power. The plane felt like it was hanging in the air, mushy and unresponsive. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, the wheels hit the tarmac. The aircraft bounced hard, lurching into the air again for a terrifying moment before slamming down a second time. It swerved violently to the left, careening toward the edge of the runway. Sakai stomped on the right rudder pedal with all his might, the muscles in his good legs screaming in protest. The plane straightened out, slowing, rumbling, until finally, after an eternity, it rolled to a stop. He was down. He was home. For a long moment, Saburo Sakai just sat there in the cockpit, the engine ticking as it cooled. The silence was deafening. He had done it. 4 hours and 47 minutes. 560 miles. He had flown his personal odyssey and had won. He tried to open the canopy to get out, but he didn't have the strength. He simply slumped forward, his consciousness finally surrendering to the darkness he had fought for so long. Ground crews and flight surgeons swarmed the aircraft. They were horrified by what they found. The Zero was a complete wreck, a sieve of over 100 bullet holes. It would never fly again. But the real shock was the pilot. When they lifted Sakai from the cockpit, they couldn't believe he was alive. His flight suit was so saturated with blood it was stiff. The left side of his head and face was a mangled ruin. He was immediately rushed to the base hospital, where surgeons worked for hours to save his life. The damage was severe. He had a fractured skull. His left arm was shattered. Metal splinters were embedded throughout his body. And the worst news of all, the vision in his right eye was permanently gone.